The morning of Aaron's anniversary party, I pressed the wrinkles out of my good blue dress, the one I'd worn to his graduation, and I drove an hour and 20 minutes up the 401. With a casserole dish balanced on the passenger seat and something heavier sitting in my chest. Not nerves exactly, more like the feeling you get before a storm rolls in off Lake Ontario, when the air goes still and a little too quiet. I parked behind a row of cars I didn't recognize, smoothed my dress, and walked up the driveway of the house my son shares with his wife. A house I helped them with the down payment on, if I'm being honest. And before I even got to the porch steps, my son stepped outside, pulled the door shut behind him so I couldn't see past him into the party, and stood there with his arms crossed like he was guarding something precious from me. Mom, this isn't a good time. I had driven an hour and 20 minutes. I had made his favorite casserole. I had RSVP'd 3 weeks ago to a party celebrating 50 years of marriage in this family. 50 years that started with my husband and me, long before his wife's family was ever part of the picture. It's not a good time, he said again, like repeating it made it true. For you to be here. I stood on that driveway with the casserole dish growing heavy in my hands. And 40 cars worth of guests' laughter drifting out through the windows behind him. And I did not cry. I want to say that clearly. Because I know how this sounds, a mother turned away from her own son's door. And you expect tears. I didn't have any left for that moment. What I had was a strange, cold clarity. The kind you get when your body already understands something your mind hasn't caught up to yet. I looked at my son, my Daniel, my boy who used to wait by the window every Friday for me to come home from the school, and I said, "All right, but I think you should check your email tonight, before you go to bed." Then I turned around, walked back down that driveway in my good blue dress, set the casserole on the passenger seat like it was something I was still planning to use, and drove home. I didn't speed. I didn't cry in the car, not even at the lights. Because what Daniel didn't know, what his wife Betrayal definitely didn't know, what not one single person inside that house with their wine glasses and their hors d'oeuvres had any idea about, was that I had spent the better part of the last year quietly, actually making sure that whatever happened on that porch, I would not be the one left standing in the cold. I should tell you who I am first, because none of this makes sense otherwise. My name is Eleanor. No, that's not right either. I keep wanting to call myself that out of habit from other stories I've heard. My name is Roslyn, and I taught grade 4 for 26 years in a small school outside Hamilton before I retired. I was not a flashy woman. I drove a Honda Civic until it had 210,000 kilometers on it. I clipped coupons out of the Saturday paper not because I needed to, particularly, but because that's how I was raised. And old habits but don't leave. Just because your circumstances change. My husband Walter was the same kind of person. Which is probably why we lasted 31 years together before the cancer took him. Walter ran a small commercial refrigeration biz. The kind that services restaurant walk-in coolers and grocery store freezers. Unglamorous work that nonetheless paid well if you were patient and reinvested instead of spent. Over 3 decades he bought up 4 small commercial properties around Hamilton and Burlington. Strip malls mostly, the kind nobody looks twice at. And he held on to them quietly while there. Value crept up year after year. We never moved out of the bungalow we bought when Daniel was 2 years old. We never bought a boat or a cottage up north like half the neighbors did. People who knew us thought we were comfortable. Maybe a little better than comfortable. They had no idea. Walter got sick 18 months after Daniel turned 30. It moved through him faster than the doctors expected. The way these things sometimes do. And in his last weeks, lucid but tired, he called me to sit beside the hospital bed. We'd set up in our own living room. And he told me something that changed how I understood the rest of my life. "Roz," he said, "what I've built, Daniel doesn't know the size of it. I need you to hold on to it. Not because I don't trust him. Because I don't yet trust whoever he's going to become, and neither do you, not completely, not yet." He had me draw up the papers with our lawyer so that everything, the properties, the investment accounts, the registered funds, would pass entirely to me first, with the eventual transfer to Daniel left fully at my discretion. Written into the trust documents, in language our lawyer assured me would hold up to any challenge. I didn't tell Daniel the real numbers. I kept living in the bungalow. I kept the Civic until it finally gave out and I replaced it with another modest car. I went to my hairdresser every 6 weeks like I always had, and I did the crossword every morning with my coffee, and I waited, the way Walter asked me to, for some sign that Daniel was ready. Brielle came into the picture about 5 months after Walter's funeral. Daniel brought her to Sunday dinner, which by itself surprised me, because Daniel hadn't been to a Sunday dinner in almost 2 months by then. She was lovely to look at, polished in a way that didn't scream money, but whispered it carefully. The kind of woman who wears a blazer to a casual dinner and makes it look effortless. She complimented my china. She asked, very early in the evening, whether the bungalow had good bones, and whether I'd ever thought about what I'd do with a place this size, now that it was just me rattling around in it. I want to tell you something I've learned, something that maybe only women my age understand fully. When you've spent 26 years watching 9-year-olds, you develop a very particular radar for who's telling the truth and who's performing the truth. Brielle was performing. She didn't ask a single question about Walter. Not what he loved, not how he died, not what kind of father he'd been to Daniel. She asked about square footage. It happened slowly after that, the way these things always do. Never one dramatic event but 100 small subtractions. Daniel's calls went from twice a week to once a week to whenever he remembered. Sunday dinners thinned out until they stopped altogether. When we did speak, certain phrases crept into his sentences that hadn't been there before. Brielle thinks. Brielle feels like. Eventually those sentences sharpened into something less innocent. Brielle thinks you're a bit much, Mom. Brielle feels like you've never really respected our space. I recognized the shape of it because I'd read about it. The slow redirection of a child away from a parent, but you never believe it'll happen in your own kitchen until it does. I found out about their engagement on Facebook, same as half the neighborhood. A photo and a caption that read, "The people who matter most were already there." I sat with my coffee that morning and read that caption 3 times. I had not been one of the people who mattered most. Then, about 4 months before the anniversary party, Daniel and Brielle showed up at the bungalow on a Tuesday evening with a folder. Brielle sat across from me at my own kitchen table, in the chair Walter used to sit in, and explained, very gently, very reasonably, that the bungalow was a lot of house for one person, and that with property values where they were in this market, it might make more sense for everyone. If I considered transferring the deed into a joint arrangement, something that would protect the asset within the family, while still letting me live there as long as I wanted. There were documents. Daniel sat beside her the entire time and said nothing, just watched. The way you watch a transaction you've already decided is fair. I asked him directly. Daniel, is this what you want? Is this coming from you? He looked at Brielle before he answered. He didn't actually answer. That silence told me everything I needed. I told them I needed time. I made tea I didn't drink. I walked them to the door with a steady hand, and when it closed behind them, I picked up the phone and called Marjorie Pham, the lawyer who'd handled Walter's estate, and who I'd kept on retainer ever since. More out of habit than need, until that moment. What I did over the following months, I did carefully, legally, and on paper. Marjorie connected me with a forensic accountant named Therese, a no-nonsense woman who spoke about fraud, the same flat way she'd talk about the weather. I did some digging of my own too. The kind retired teachers are apparently quite good at when they put their minds to it. A picture took shape over those months. Brielle had a history. There had been a previous relationship with an older, well-established businessman in Oakville. A relationship that ended with a quiet, sealed settlement after a property dispute. Nobody talked about publicly. She'd left that city under a different surname and a fresh start. There was more. Bank records, pulled through entirely proper legal channels once. Marjorie filed the right disclosure requests. Showed that Daniel had taken out a substantial line of credit against his condo in the months after meeting Brielle, and the funds had landed in a joint account, opened just before their engagement, an account Brielle controlled almost entirely. I also had a recorded phone call, made with Daniel's full knowledge and consent, where he'd said several things about the bungalow and the estate that simply weren't true. Not as opinions, but as facts that could be checked and disproven. By the week of the anniversary party, I had a binder, a flash drive, and a conversation with Marjorie that ended with her looking me in the eye and saying, "Roslyn, you are protected. Completely." What I sent to Daniel's email at 7:40 that evening, just as I heard the muffled bass of music starting up behind that closed door he'd stood in front of, wasn't a threat, and it wasn't even really addressed to him in an angry way. It was 3 attachments. A full accounting of his father's estate that he had genuinely never seen. A letter from Marjorie explaining that under the terms of the trust, any transfer of the bungalow or the commercial properties was now formally suspended pending review, due to documented evidence of coercion and financial misrepresentation, and a photograph, obtained legally through public land registry records, of Betrayal signing a notarized document 11 days earlier, under a name that was not Betrayal Caro, the name she'd given our entire family. I know what happened in that house, because Daniel called me a little after 11 that night, and he said Betrayal's real name, the one from the documents, 3 times. Before he managed to say anything else coherent, he told me the party had been going fine. People dancing. His uncle making a toast. When he stepped away to check his phone out of habit, and his hands started shaking before he even finished reading. He told me he walked into the kitchen, away from the guests, and Betrayal followed him, and whatever was said between them in that kitchen, I wasn't there for it. But it ended with her leaving through the side door, getting into a car that wasn't his, and not coming back, not that night and not since. The guests sat with their drinks for the better part of an hour, before Daniel went back out and quietly told everyone the party was over. I don't take pleasure in chaos. I want to be honest about that. What I take some quiet satisfaction in is this. My son drove the hour and 20 minutes to my bungalow that same night, sat down at my kitchen table in his father's old chair, and cried in a way I hadn't seen since he was small, and scraped his knee on the driveway. He said, "Mom, I don't even know who she actually was." And I put my hand over his and said, "I know, that's exactly why I had to find out." We sat at that table until nearly 2 in the morning. He told me everything. The slow pressure. The way she'd convinced him I was controlling. That my love came with strings. That putting distance between us was something healthy he was doing for himself. He believed every word of it while it was happening. Because that's the cruel trick of that kind of influence. It never feels like manipulation while it's happening to you. It feels like finally seeing clearly. In the months after, things settled the way these things eventually do. Betrayal didn't disappear quietly. She retained a lawyer, and tried to make a claim against the estate, based on promises Daniel had supposedly made her. Marjorie's documentation was thorough enough that the claim never made it past a preliminary hearing. The sealed Oakville settlement surfaced through proper channels and ended any momentum her case had. She left for Calgary not long after, as far as I know. Daniel spent that winter doing real work on himself, seeing a counselor in Hamilton every other week, calling me not every day. We were never that kind of family, but regularly and honestly. Eventually the estate transferred to him in full, under the terms Walter had set out, terms Marjorie confirmed had never wavered. He didn't rush into anything with it. He spent half a year just learning the businesses, keeping Walter's old property manager on instead of replacing him, making slow decisions instead of fast ones. One Sunday that spring, he came by the bungalow and asked me something I hadn't expected. "Dad left you a letter, didn't he? The sealed one. What did it say?" I'd kept that letter folded in the back of my nightstand drawer for nearly 2 years, read once and never again. I got up and brought it to him. He read it in silence, and when he looked up his eyes were wet. Walter had written, "If you're reading this, son, it means your mother did exactly what I asked of her. She protected you. Even when you didn't know you needed protecting. Even when you pushed her away to do it. She is the best person I have ever known. And don't you dare forget it." Daniel didn't say anything for a long while. Then he said, "I won't forget it again. I'm not telling you this story to make myself out as some kind of hero, because I made my own mistakes along the way. Conversations I should have had sooner. Moments where keeping the peace felt easier than telling the truth. And looking back, I'm not sure that was peace at all, just postponement. But here's what 30 years of marriage and 26 years of watching 9-year-olds figure each other out has taught me. The quiet ones in the room are usually the ones who see the most clearly. Not because they're cold, but because they're not performing for anyone. They're watching. They're paying attention while everyone else assumes they've stopped mattering. Betrayal underestimated me the same way a lot of people Underestimate a woman my age standing alone at a party with a casserole dish. She saw stillness and mistook it for nothing left to lose. She saw exactly the wrong thing. If you're a mother right now watching someone slowly pull your child away from you, I'm not going to pretend I know your situation. Every family carries its own particular fractures. But I'll tell you what I know now. Don't waste your energy trying to convince anyone of your worth. Spend it documenting, protecting, building quietly while everyone else assumes you've already lost. The truth doesn't need to be shouted to land. Sometimes it just needs to arrive in an inbox at exactly the right moment. So here's what I keep asking myself even now. How many people out there are slowly being convinced they're someone they're not? And what would it actually take for the people who love them to finally see it?